So it's a totally different gene. And so remember that, real quickly here, A blood has the A antigen, B blood has the B antigen, AB has the A and the B antigen, and O blood does not have either neither A nor B. And then we have the Rh factor. That is another gene that puts another antigen on the surface of our red blood cells, and so positive versus negative. And so positive, it's another whole antigen on the surface. So I'm putting here a different antigen, kind of square shape that's different than the shape of the A antigen and the B antigen. And the negative people do not have that antigen. And so therefore, when we look at, and you have, let's say, an A positive blood person, what that means is they have the A antigen, and then they also have that Rh factor antigen as well. And so that would be an A positive person. And so, so when we look at blood types and we talk about what types of blood can go into what people, what type of blood, including the positive or negative, could go and give blood to anybody.
Oh, negative. Negative.
So let's think about this. To give blood to anything or anybody, you would want to have nothing on the surface that the other person would view and see as foreign. So the person that truly does not have any of those antigens are the O negative people. So the O negative people don't have any antigens. If you have the O positive people, O positive has that Rh antigen, which means O positive can give to what would need to be true about the AB and AB people. They would also need to be positive, all right? And then they would be able to give it to them. All right, so that's what the Rh factor is, and that's what the positive and negative part of our blood in blood typing means. All right, so one other thing with this, a red blood cell antigen, the Rh factor, is creates difficulties in pregnancy for a mother who is Rh negative. So a mother who has Rh negative and has successive Rh positive babies, meaning that she has multiple babies that have the positive part of their blood type, can be difficult. And so that means that the mother's blood has this antigen on here. The child, the baby, does not. Opposite. All right, so the child is Rh positive, and then the mother does not. So what happens is that when in pregnancy, towards the end of pregnancy, you run a risk of some of the baby's blood getting into the mother's blood. Remember I showed you that picture with the placenta and how the exchange can occur between baby and mother? So later on in the pregnancy and have that issue. So what happens is, if the child's red blood cells are positive, they have this antigen, gets into the mother's blood, the mother does not have that antigen. So guess what she does is she goes through a primary immune response because that's something foreign to her. And so she goes through the primary immune response and makes memory cells against this Rh antigen. Now this we found does not hurt the first baby that she has that's Rh positive. But what happens is if she gets pregnant again and has another Rh positive baby, and that happens where the Rh positive blood of the baby gets and mixes with the mother, she now has a very quick response because she has memory cells against that Rh antigen, and she starts producing antibodies that will bind to the red blood cells of the baby in her. But the thing about the antibodies is when she produces these antibodies, it'll bind to the baby's blood that's in her blood, but the danger comes because the antibodies can cross over in the placenta to the baby's blood. So if all these antibodies against this antigen here gets into the baby, it's going to bind with all the baby's blood, and it can be deadly. It's a big deal because it's like attacking the baby's blood. And so that's why it says successive Rh positive fetuses. So what they found is for mothers who are Rh negative, they don't really do tests to see if you're carrying a positive baby because it's invasive. Like you'd have to do an amniocentesis where it's sticking a needle and it punctures the uterus and the amniotic sac that the baby's in, and there's some risks involved in there. So a mother who is negative, towards the end of pregnancy, they give them a shot called a RhoGAM shot. What that shot has in it is antibodies against that antigen. So what they found is that if exchange occurs late in pregnancy where the baby's blood gets into the mother, these antibodies that we gave the shot to the mom are floating around in the mother's blood. These antibodies bind to her right away, and therefore the mother's own immune system never really launches an attack against them. So then she doesn't develop memory cells, so then she doesn't have the problem of having and attacking the next baby. And so they give that shot before birth and after birth as well, just to make sure. Okay? And so it's been very successful with that. All right, let's look at now. So we talked about blood and getting other people's cells. You okay? Yeah. And then we have organ transplants or receiving tissues from other people. And it's these MHC molecules that are really important in matching. These are those proteins on the surface of your cells. So, so they are what stimulate rejection. We've talked. You've probably heard of tissue or organs being rejected. What that is the receiver of the organ or the tissue, their immune system attacking the transplanted organ or tissue because they have different molecules on the outside of them, and so therefore they view them as foreign. And so these molecules are MHC molecules. And what happens is we've got a bunch of MHC molecules, and each one of them are governed by different genes. But the thing is that the collection of MHC molecules on your cells are different than the collection of MHC molecules on my cells. And so therefore, what they have to do for an organ to be transferred from one person to another is they have to look at those collection of MHC molecules and try to get the best match to the person who needs the tissue or the organ. And so those MHC molecules are governed by genes, genetics, so it makes sense that you would look at people closely related to you first and then go out from there. And so on. So that's what they're trying to do. And so they get the closest matches possible because that's going to be the less likely that the person receiving the organ is going to launch an attack against them. And then they usually, to help with the acceptance of the organ, is they also give them drugs to suppress their immune system so their immune system won't launch an attack against them. And so that's what the next two bullets are. So chances of successful transplantation increase if donor and recipient MHC tissue types are well matched. And they give these immunosuppressive drugs that facilitate transplantation. This could be like organ, tissue types. Some people get bone marrow transplants and so on, and so they have to match them up. And so they have big databases. Like for bone marrow, they have huge databases where they only have to take. There's an organization called Be the Match for bone marrow, and all they need to see about your MHC tissue types is a swab inside of your cheek. If you take like a Q-tip and swab the inside of your cheek, some of your epithelial cells on the surface of your cheek will come off, and they can test your cells and test your MHC molecules and things like that. And they put you in a database, and so they have this whole computerized database of people who have volunteered in this, and then somebody who needs like a transplant or a bone marrow transplant, they go in this database and can find matches that way.
How do bone marrow transplants work?
Like the logistics of it.
Yeah.
Well, they basically take out they take out the donors, some of the donors' bone marrow, and replace it. Like so there's stem cells that in there that can divide and differentiate and replace and take out the recipients and replace them. All right, so you literally have somebody else's. Yes, which is why though, because remember the bone marrow, there are stem cells that divide and differentiate into your B and your T cells of your immune system. So it's important that that the MHC molecules and so on match, so you don't reject that and so on. So, all right. And then this last section is about when things are disrupted in the immune system. So we're going to look at some disruptions. So allergies is one of these. So allergies, a lot of people suffer from allergies, and they can range in severity. But what an allergy is, an allergic response, is an exaggerated response to antigens that we call allergens. So allergens are just things in our environment that have antigens on the surface of them that for some reason some people have a exaggerated response to. And so an example of an allergen would be like a pollen grain. All right, so a lot of people will have different allergies to different types of pollen. It could be a molecule in food, certain types of food. So a lot of people have peanut allergies, and so on. So notice here, so it's the IgE antibodies. You don't need to, again, know these classes here. So antibodies are produced after the first exposure to, let's say, a pollen grain, an allergen. And these antibodies attach to receptors on cells called mast cells. So what happens is the next time that you come into contact with that allergen or that pollen or whatever it may be, when it enters the body, it binds to the mast cell in the antibody. The IgE is the antibody. And that triggers your mast cells to release histamine that causes vascular changes. Vascular is meaning blood vessel. Leading to typical allergy symptoms. So I'll show you a picture here to explain this. People who have severe allergies can have what's called an acute allergic response. This is more localized, like it can affect your respiratory system. Acute allergic response can lead to anaphylactic shock that can be life-threatening very quickly after a person comes into contact with the allergen. So let's talk about this part here in this histamine. So we learned about histamine. Oops, going the wrong way. We learned about histamine. I put this slide in again. This was at the beginning of the notes. We learned about histamine when we talked about the inflammatory response. So in this case here, the pinprick, allowed foreign bacteria into the body because that was on the edge of the pin. And then so that stimulates cells called mast cells, and they're not shown here, to release chemical signals. The chemical signal was histamine. And histamine caused a couple of things to happen at the site. The blood vessels dilate, and that's the first thing. And the second thing is the blood vessels became more leaky, allowing cells, the white blood cells, to come and get rid of the bacteria, as well as antimicrobial proteins and fluids and so on. And that's what causes the swelling. So how this relates to allergies is that in the first exposure to the allergen, so the first exposure, you produce the antibodies. So first exposure, you produce the antibodies, and guess what they do? These guys attach to to the mast cell. And that's what this is showing you here. This is the antibodies there attaching to the mast cell. That's your first exposure. So now the next time you come into contact with this, so that's what this is showing you. This is an antibody. Again, you don't need to know the specific types there. So then the next time you come into contact with that allergen, you have all these kind of receptors that used to be antibodies on this mast cell, and these allergens attach to those receptors and trigger a release of histamine. And the histamine, this causes, so this is your second exposure, and exposure, you get this release of histamine. The histamine dilates your blood vessels. So if this is your blood vessel before, so your smallest blood vessels are your capillaries. So this is a capillary. It dilates. So histamine causes that to dilate. So we have the diameter much greater. And then also, the second thing that the histamine causes to happen, as we looked at before, is it becomes leaky, and so those fluids and cells and so on come out of the blood vessel. And so when you, let's say, breathe in the pollen, it can affect then these mast cells that already have these antibodies attached to it. And so you have all these mast cells in your respiratory system that then simultaneously start releasing all this histamine, which means all your blood vessels dilate and become leaky. And that's where you get like your runny nose thing and your watery eyes is common symptoms for allergies for people. And so so that last bullet that we previously wrote, that some people have a really exaggerated response where it can be life-threatening for the anaphylactic shock. So for that, what happens is instead of the allergen having a localized effect, like just in the respiratory systems, you get the runny nose and watery eyes and things like that going on. It's more systemic throughout the body, and so they get the allergen into them, and it causes the capillaries around the body to dilate, and so they have this widespread release of histamine. So what happens to your blood pressure when the capillaries dilate and they become leaky? It decreases because you have more space, so it's going to produce less pressure against the walls of the capillary, and that can be life-threatening. And so therefore, people who have this type of, or could have this type of reaction to an allergen usually carry around what is called an EpiPen. Epi stands for epinephrine. Epinephrine is a natural hormone that we make in our body. The layman's term for epinephrine is adrenaline. And epinephrine, what that does is combat this, because one of the things that epinephrine does is constrict blood vessels. So therefore it constricts the blood vessels and therefore brings the blood pressure back up and so on. It can save a person's life. And so that's an EpiPen, and Epi stands for epinephrine.
Why is it when some people have allergies they start coughing?
It just has to do with all the excess fluid and the mucus and so on. It agitates, and so it's your body's way. Coughing is kind of your body's way of getting rid of that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I had a friend that was actually over the summer, and she was stung by a bee, and she went into a severe anaphylactic shock, and then so she was rushed to the hospital and stuff, and then they brought her back, and then she had another one which was worse than the first one. But she wasn't stung again. So she had another anaphylactic shock from the same bee sting, but it was.
Okay, so they didn't give enough, maybe epinephrine, because
I
even
don't know.
like we're given training about what to do. Like we just had a meeting last week. It's like daunting, like the responsibility. Like if a kid does, it happens, So if somebody went in there, we're told that you have to give the epinephrine shot, and then you still call 911 because we never know if that's going to be enough to we don't know the severity of it, but it buys time. Yeah, so they probably shouldn't have released her from the hospital. Yeah. What country were you in? Oh, we're in, okay. All right. So, I was just curious. All right, so yeah, she probably shouldn't have been released.
Well, like, what causes that? Is it just?
It's just that still the allergen is still in there and can still trigger mast cells to release histamine. Yeah, which then causes the thing to happen all over, you know.
So does the epinephrine like flush the allergen out, or what does it do to actually stop? Is it just
No, it counteracts the effects of it. So it doesn't stop. So their immune system will eventually get rid of the allergen, just like it would a pathogen. So that will happen naturally over time. But in the meantime, you've got this histamine that's dilating the blood vessels. The epinephrine is counteracting that so that it's not life-threatening. Okay. And then people with minor allergies will take antihistamines. And so what they do is they block histamine receptors, so it doesn't stop the mast cells from releasing the histamine, but there are histamine receptors on the other cells of the body that cause the blood vessels to dilate, so they block those receptors, so therefore the histamine can't work. So the histamine is still present, but just doesn't have the effect because the receptors are blocked.
But someone with an antihistamine, would that affect what would happen if they got like a cut? Would they not, would not swallow, would it not heal?
It's such a small amount of time. The chances of that, the antihistamine, when you take it, it's not a long-term effect. Well, usually, like, there are medications, so when people have allergies, like allergy medications often have, and so it can, but at the dosage and stuff like that's not gonna be enough to, like, you're not gonna not heal properly. So it's not that strong of a, That's a good question, though. All right, we've already talked about autoimmune diseases, but I want to talk a little bit about that some more here. So, autoimmune disease also affects the immune system. It loses tolerance for self and turns against certain molecules of the body. Rheumatoid arthritis is an example of this. Your immune system attacks the cartilage and so on in the joints and can lead to damage and inflammation of the joints. When it says up here that it loses tolerance for self, so remember that you make your lymphocytes, your B and your T cells, in your bone marrow you have stem cells that divide and differentiate into B and T cells. Part of that, when you make a whole bunch of different B cells, let's say, and so what your body will do is, after these B cells are made, remember the B cells have those Y-shaped receptors that at the ends can bind to antigens. And so you will actually make some of your immune system cells that can bind to antigens to you. So that's not good, because then your immune system will attack you. So therefore what your body does is trigger apoptosis in those cells. So those cells that can actually bind to your antigens are killed off. So what happens with autoimmune diseases is that does not happen. So therefore there's a problem with it. So your body is not killing off those cells that can bind to some of your antigens. And so that's how it can turn against cells of your body. And different cells of your body have different antigens on them. And so, like, you have some antigens that are the same between every type of cell, but then you can have different types of cells, like stomach cells and the cells of your pancreas. They have some antigens that are in common, but the stomach cells have certain antigens that the pancreas cells do not. And so that's how like your immune system can attack one type of cell in your body. So like the cartilage in your joints, and it's not attacking every single cell of your body. And so then this is an x-ray of a person with rheumatoid arthritis. So it affects the joints, it inflames them. It also can cause disfiguration as well. So the joints become disfigured. Anybody know anybody with rheumatoid arthritis? I know several people with that. All right, some other examples of autoimmune diseases. The one that I'm going to expect you to know, for sure, because we've already spent some time on it here, is the insulin-dependent diabetes. That's type 1 diabetes. We've already talked about that, how the immune system kills off the beta cells of the pancreas. But there's other autoimmune diseases, lupus, MS, or multiple sclerosis. And so I put in parentheses what they attack just to show that your immune system is attacking different types of cells, and therefore you have different side effects for different diseases. But the insulin-dependent diabetes is the one that I'm going to have you know for sure. The College Board for AP, for teaching certain things, they give us choices. So they'll say, like, for autoimmune diseases, you can use an example such as, and they'll give us a list of diseases. And so that way we don't have to teach every single disease, we just pick one. That means on the test, they won't ask specifically about, you know, the logistics of type 1 or insulin-dependent diabetes, but they might ask you about what happens to your immune system in an autoimmune disease and give an example. And so then you would go, oh, I know the example of type 1 diabetes, and you can explain it. All right, so that's how that works. Then we have immunodeficiency diseases. This is different than autoimmune diseases. There's two kinds, or two categories of immunodeficiency diseases. The first one is what is called inborn or primary immunodeficiency. It's hereditary. You have it when you're born. And it causes defects in your immune system that prevent the proper functioning of the innate, humoral, and cell-mediated responses. And then there's acquired immunodeficiencies. Those are things that you acquire during your lifetime. So you're not born with a deficiency in your immune system, but you can get it within your lifetime. So let's look at here. When it says what you're born with can affect the innate, humoral, and/or cell-mediated. I just want to give us a big picture here. Innate immunity. Do you guys remember what innate immunity means? You're born with it, and is it general or specific? Or general. So this is you're born with, and is more general in nature. Your humoral and cell-mediated defenses are more specific. What's the type of immunity that represents? Humoral, is that innate? Those are two examples. Humoral and cell-mediated are examples of acquired. So we have acquired immunity, and so we have two kinds of that, humoral and cell-mediated. And so what we're saying here is these diseases that people are born with can affect this part, or the whole thing. And so let's look at an inborn or hereditary immunodeficiency, severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID, S-C-I-D. Terrible disease. It affects both the humoral and cell-mediated branches of acquired immunity. So that's these two branches here. Notice here that they fail to function. So that's a big deal, because the acquired immunity is your specific, it's with all your memory cells and so on. Humoral affects the B cells, and cell-mediated is the cytotoxic T cells. And so basically, if these two pathways don't work, you can't make antibodies to fight against infections. You can't, these guys kill off infected cells, so once a cell is infected, you can't do anything with that. So this is a big deal for this. And so people with this disease often are pretty much homebound. Like it's, they can, coming into contact with different pathogens can be deadly for them. They can't fight off it. So they can, where like a person with a healthy immune system might get pneumonia, but be able to fight and bounce back from that. And then these people may die from it, all right? So it's a big deal. Then acquired immunodeficiencies. There are different examples, some that are temporary and some that are more permanent. A temporary example is the relationship between stress and the immune system. And so there's a lot of evidence, a lot of different studies about stress, both emotional and physical stress, that stress suppresses the immune system. So therefore, people who are under stress will get sick more frequently because their immune system is weakened. And that's not, that's only temporary, that's not forever. So once that stress goes away, your immune system can work properly again. So that's an example of a temporary effect on the immune system. They've also found sleep. They've done studies with sleep in adults that get less than 7 hours of sleep when exposed to a cold virus. They found that they're 3 times as more likely to develop the cold versus adults that get 8 or more hours of sleep. They are less likely to get for their immune system to be weakened. All right, and the last thing here is with the suppressed immune system and immunodeficiency, another acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, otherwise known as AIDS. So people with AIDS are susceptible to infections and cancers that take advantage of the immune system and collapse. Why is the immune system in collapse? Because AIDS arises from the loss of helper T cells. So it therefore impairs both the humoral and cell-mediated responses. And so this loss of helper T cells is because of the effects of the virus called HIV. So the HIV virus is the pathogen. It affects the helper T cells, which then affects the immune system. So remember, the helper T cells, they're not involved in fighting your infection directly, but they activate the humoral and cell-mediated response. And so therefore, with people who get infected with the HIV virus, it starts to affect their helper T cells over time, which then affects their B cells in making antibodies, and affects their cell-mediated response to attack infected cells. They have suppressed immune systems, and so therefore, coming into contact with pathogens that may not be harmful for most people, they can again, get very sick from a cold or a flu virus, all right? And so therefore it can be almost deadly because of that. And so that's an immunodeficiency. So the virus is HIV, the disease, once you start showing the symptoms of the destruction of your helper T cells, you are said to have the disease AIDS, all right? So AIDS is caused by the infection by the HIV virus. And so, so this is obviously a worldwide problem, and so they're looking to, especially in third world countries where education might not be as great in terms of the population knowing what causes and spreads HIV, education is a big deal to help with spread that. All right, and that is the immune system. So as I wrote up here, you guys, the couple things. The immunity packet, we didn't get to that this hour. Some hours I started going over that. What I'm going to do is just I'm going to scan the answers in it. I want you to look over it and check your packet and come to class tomorrow with questions. This way I'm only going over the parts that you have questions on. So I'm not going to go over the whole thing if you only have questions on 3 things. Okay.
So like, is there any like
together, and then once they're already
2 days ago,
It was so recording.